Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know a couple of you are coming in and seeing the lovely faces of our experts today. My name is Luisa del Rosal. I'm the Executive Director of the SMU Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center. Our center was created with the sole purpose of understanding the dynamic relationship between Texas and Mexico. And we would not be here without the support and leadership of Gruma Mission Foods. So we thank them for the vision and leadership to want to invest in this dynamic relationship. We are a marketplace of ideas, so our interest is studying it, but then also understanding what's happening on the ground from the perspectives of practitioners and policymakers, and that is what we're going to have today. If anybody has questions, feel free to do it through our Q&A. For those of you watching on Facebook Live, please send your questions via the comments and we'll be monitoring those as well. And before I get started, I want to thank two of our board members, our faculty board members that are here, Dr. Livy Russ. Thank you, Livy, for always being part of our ideas and choosing the grants that we fund. And also one of our biggest champions on the campus at SMU and our partner in crime, Dr. Jim Hollifield. He is there. We wouldn't be here without you, Jim. Thank you so much. So thank you all for joining us. And I get the privilege of introducing first our research fellow, a great colleague. We're very lucky to be working with Ariel Ruiz Soto. He's a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, where he works on U.S. migration policy program. He also manages MPI's internship program. So he leads young minds, which we really appreciate. His research focuses on the impact of U.S. immigration policies on immigrants and other populations, and the interaction between U.S., Mexico, and Central America migration policies. He is one of the lead researchers on the work you will hear from today. He has a master's degree from the University of Chicago School of Social Service with an emphasis on migration policy and service provision, and a bachelor's degree in sociology from Whitman. His research has been published in the Latino Studies, in Crossing the United States-Mexico Border. And again, it's just a privilege to be able to work with Ariel. Joining him from the practitioner perspective, we have two good friends from Laredo College, Dr. Ricardo Solis. He is the president of Laredo College. He's actively involved for over 20 years in international economic and workforce development prior to entering into higher education, which is a perfect way to enter higher education because he understands uniquely human capital and how that our economies need a developed workforce. He earned a doctorate in higher education administration from the University of Texas at Austin and holds an MBA in international management from Midbury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. He served in several academic positions and capacities before being named the president of Laredo College. He was the executive dean at Gateway Maricopa College, the largest college system in the United States. Thank you, Dr. Solis, for being with us. He's joined by his colleague, Michael Gonzalez, who is a senior director for external affairs at Laredo College. He's charged with creating and maintaining all the external partnerships. That includes us. Thank you, Michael. With individuals and organizations from a wide spectrum of the regional community and across the state. And we're so pleased that he wanted to be a partner with us and brought us this great opportunity with Dr. Solis. So I can talk on and on because these are three very accomplished gentlemen, but you really want to hear from them. So I'm going to get off your screen and pass the baton to Ariel. Please take us away.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you, everybody joining us for today. This is a great conversation for us to pick up again. I should say, as I'm going to share my screen here in a moment, that the presentation today really comes forward from a previous work that we've done with SMU, and we wanted to provide a little bit of an update. The topic for today is going to be looking at high-skilled Mexican immigrants in Texas and the United States, but we really want to focus on the different layered levels of how immigrants are doing in the state to ensure and provide some emphasis. And I'm happy to have the folks from Laredo College to be able to really comment on some of the key things that we're working on as well and what they're seeing on the ground. Certainly, the data is just one aspect of what we know from this population. Let me start by saying that at MPI, one of the key things that we have started to do in the past is looking at highly skilled immigrant populations and how their trends have changed. By highly immigrant population or high skilled population, what we mean is population of immigrants in the United States who are 25 years or older and have at least a bachelor's degree. This, of course, is not the only definition of understanding how high skilled, excuse me, high skilled immigration works in the United States, but it is also a recent component, for example, including some students who go through community college so that they can actually come to get their bachelor's degree. That's a key pipeline here that we don't cover, but is significantly included on what we look at. So I'm gonna start the presentation here by first looking at the education attainment of migrants or immigrants in Texas and the United States, giving you a historical perspective into how these categories have changed over time. I'll tell you right away that the population in Texas, the Mexican immigrant population in Texas that has a college degree right now, well, as of 2019, which is the closest data that we have, is 216,000 Mexican immigrants have at least a college degree in Texas. And in the United States, there are about 807,000 Mexicans with a college degree. So in total, about a little bit over a quarter, 27% or so of the highly educated Mexican immigrant population actually lives in Texas. And this is only second to California, and not by as much as you may think. Of course, these trends have changed. And one of the key components that I want to try to separate here is that this trend is part of a bigger trend that we have observed over the last decades, which shows that at least since 2000, the newer waves of immigrants coming to the United States are more and more educated. They're more likely to come or receive education degrees in the United States or in their place of origin. What you see in the slides on the left is the blue, or I guess the purple lavender color bars that indicate on 2 points. The first one is looking at Mexican immigrants who arrived in the past 5 years, meaning, for example, in 2005, that came between 2005 and between 2000 and 2005. In 2019, that would be between 2015 and 19. And the clear trend that you see in the dark bars is that with each decade or each 5 years or so, you begin to see an increase from 6%, for example, of the Mexican immigrant population coming in the last 5 years, having a college degree, a bachelor's degree. And now in 2019, that share is now 19%. When you look at Texas, the graph on the right side of your screen in the blue and teal bars, you see a similar change from 7% in 2000 to 17% in 2019. There's an important thing to note here, and that's that between 2015 and 17, there's a slight decrease in the population that has a degree, but it's not by much. It's only 19 to 17. The lighter bars look at all immigrants, the total immigrant population in the United States and in Texas, and you can see a similar, though smaller, increase in the population size. For example, in 2000 in Texas, there was 5% of Mexican immigrants had a college degree and a bachelor's degree, and then in 2019 it was 10%. So it's clearly that's a key component. When we did this research in 2019, we were looking at 2017 figures, and at that time, the share was 8%. And why that matters is because it looks differently. This increase between 8 and 10% has actually manifested differently across different metropolitan areas in Texas. What we have seen is that, in particular, Dallas has increased in number and in size. The number of the Mexican immigrant population that has a bachelor's degree, now having about 46,000, as you can see here on the first column, of college-educated immigrant populations from Mexico, and a total immigrant population of about 544,000, meaning that about 8% of the population in Dallas, Mexican immigrant population in Dallas, has a bachelor's degree. If you look at the state level, of course, as I mentioned, it's 10. So 1 in every 10 Mexican immigrants in Texas has a bachelor's degree. And again, that's really important. Houston is the second metropolitan area that we look at and has a similar area of, or a similar share of college-educated Mexican immigrants, and that's important too. But the key component was that the key difference here is that in 2017, Houston was the #1 metropolitan area. And so now it's #2, second to Dallas. McAllen, El Paso, and San Antonio are areas that we also look at, in particular with McAllen and El Paso, considering how their proximity to the border may affect the way that in the share that we see for Mexican immigrants having college degrees is important. You can see, for example, that in El Paso, 15% of Mexican immigrants have a college degree. In McAllen, it's 12%. And so that's above the state average. Notably to include here as well. The other categories is all the other metropolitan areas combined, and we could not lay them out because of the low sample size. How this has changed over time is another piece that's important for us to understand. And what you can see here in the graph, there's this dotted green bar that shows you the state average into how the share of Mexican educated immigrants, college educated immigrants from Mexico have changed. You can see that it's been a steady increase since 2000 and has grown slightly after that. But you can also see that there's 3 lines above that dotted line that suggest that El Paso, McAllen, and San Antonio areas actually have had a higher share of Mexican immigrant, college-educated immigrants in the United States, or in Texas, I mean. The one thing to note is that San Antonio between 2015 and 2019 has actually reduced in size. Not by much, it's usually between about 13% to now about 11%, but it is something to take a look at compared to, for example, El Paso, which has continued to be in a steady increase as McAllen as well. Obviously, the 2 bigger cities, the 2 bigger metropolitan areas here is Houston and Dallas. And you can see that in that regard, both of them have become, even though they're lower than the average, they represent the larger majority in terms of the numbers per se. And you can see that, for example, Houston has begun to decrease a little bit, and Dallas has picked up steadily since 2015. There are some reasons for us, there are some things that we could analyze to look at this, and I can't say that we have done everything that we could to look at that, but the key components and some of the guesses that the hypotheses that we've had for why the changes occurred is including some internal migration in the state, as well as, for example, Mexican immigrants moving to Texas from other parts of the country, including from California, for different reasons. And this is, again, in 2018, so it would be prior to the pandemic that we've seen here. Now, the other component, of course, that's important for us to understand is where does the Mexican immigrant population with a bachelor's degree, where are they employed? And so what you see in this slide is the top 5 industries where this population is employed at the state level and at the metropolitan areas. In Texas, and really across the board, elementary and secondary schools are the #1 industry that employs Mexican immigrant bachelor's degree holders. Now, here I want to be very specific. This includes from teachers to principals to custodians to anybody else that's employed in the schools. And so it's not all teachers, though some of them are, and in fact, close to a majority are. The second, in Texas, the second industry that's important to highlight here is construction. And construction certainly varies in degrees of skill, including, for example, folks that could be doing more architectural work, but also doing more of the electrician works and other occupations within that are important and require higher skill education. The third is the restaurants and other food services. And perhaps this begins to show us places where, even though Mexican immigrants are highly educated, are employed in or underemployed in industries that don't allow or provide them an opportunity to really develop the skills that they've learned. And 4 are hospitals. You see that in Texas. You see also that in Houston as well as the 4th possibility. And 5 is colleges and universities. I won't say much about the different distributions within each of the cities. I think you can see it from the slide. And elementary schools, again, are #1 across the board. Construction is almost #1, second across the board, except for in El Paso. And really, restaurants are the 3rd place here. Again, what's important to know from this slide is that depending on what metropolitan area Mexican immigrants are living or residing in, there's a different makeup in their occupational and industrial type of employment. These figures that you see in front of you now look at the share of Mexican college graduates that, and again, bachelor degree college graduates that across different immigration statuses. What the important component that we look at here is that the majority of Mexican immigrants with a college degree are actually have some sort of legal status. If you look, for example, in the United States, only 30% of college-educated Mexicans, bachelor's degree college-educated Mexicans have or are in the country without authorization or undocumented. In Texas, the percentage it's even lower, so it's 27%. And these numbers come from about 2016 when we last looked at the data. But it's important here to know that, that really immigration status is a minor component of the larger population, especially in Texas, where it's only 27%. You see that there's a good portion of folks who are naturalized citizens and 23% who are green card holders or legal permanent residents. When you look, though, at the shares of across groups that have a college degree by legal status, you see that temporary visa holders have significantly high degrees of educational attainment. And that's, in fact, very much explained by the requirements that Mexican migrants require to have visa allocations. Many of them are required to have a bachelor's degree to be able to come to the United States and work in a particular industry. If you compare that, for example, with undocumented or unauthorized workers, that's about 4 or 5% of them that have a college degree, depending on where you look at Texas or the United States. In naturalized citizens, actually, there's a slightly higher share of naturalized citizen or Mexican college graduates with a bachelor's degree that indeed have a degree in Texas compared to the 10% in the United States. And green card holders is about the same. Again, LPR holders are a smaller proportion here, but the key factor here is to contrast the temporary visa holders versus those that have an unauthorized status or are undocumented in the country. Again, status matters, and this is what this shows. I won't go too much into the demographic profile here, but it serves to show that the Mexican immigrant population is relatively young, usually between 35 and 54 age groups. That there is actually a majority of it is female. It varies across metropolitan areas. For example, in Dallas, it's a higher proportion. It's almost 60% of college-educated Mexicans are identified as female. And then, but what I do want to focus on and talk a little bit about is English proficiency. English proficiency is perhaps another limitation that a lot of Mexican immigrants face in the United States when they try to look and seek employment. 43% of college-educated Mexicans in Texas had limited English proficiency, which means that they spoke English less than very well. If you look at across the board, the shares change a little bit. The share is higher in McAllen with 58%, and it's relatively low in San Antonio with only 29%. But for Houston and Dallas, there's really not that much of a difference. And in fact, it's a little bit lower than the state average of 43. Poverty, I think it's an important note to look here. You see that 8% of Mexican immigrant college graduates with a bachelor's degree have or are below 100% of the federal poverty level. That again varies as well, but it's not significantly varying except for in McAllen, which again is perhaps has different reasonings for it. Labor force participation is high across the board, no matter what metropolitan area you look at. Specifically in Dallas, college-educated Mexican immigrants are working largely, 83% of them, and it's important for us to keep that in mind. Again, the question here is potential mismatch between their abilities and the occupations they serve, and we hope to get into that in the conversation. My conclusion here is that one of the key things that we can see with this data is clearly that the Mexican immigrant population is becoming more and more educated in the last decades. And that Texas is a particular key player in the conversation because it is the second state with the largest Mexican college-educated population. And again, this includes immigrants who received their degrees in Mexico, but also immigrants who may have received their degrees in the United States, some of them going through community colleges, of course. The second piece here, though, is to try to understand that even though this trend is increasing, there are some factors that we should consider to try to understand how Mexican immigrants could benefit more, and so their communities, from engaging in a different occupation in the future and being allowed to participate more broadly in the economy. Of course, there are some things that we can look at and we can talk about, for example, the potential increase of nursing, leveraging nursing, for example, in Texas, where given the pandemic, something that could be really helpful. We can look at construction for reconstructing a lot of the different damages that were really, that happened in Texas this last year, and as well as other occupations like logistical and technology that it really hasn't come up, but could be a really important source of opportunity. The last point that I'll mention to you here before going into the conversation is to understand as well that despite the limitation of English language ability and status, there are people that are thriving in this population, especially in some areas and some sectors in Texas, and learning from their opportunities and specifically what the governments of these metropolitan areas could be doing to enhance and really leverage that human capital is something that should be not only important in the local level, in the state level, but really at the national level, how we can leverage and how we can channel Mexican and other immigrant bachelor's degree educated people to be assured that they can continue to invest in their communities and be able to provide not only a benefit for themselves, but also for folks that may be coming after them. So again, we didn't get to talk about all the data, and certainly there's some data missing here, but I wanted to make sure that we provide enough opportunity for conversation. If you do have any other questions, you're welcome to email me at my email below here. And you can, I hope we can continue to have this conversation in the future with SMU, since I think this will be very particularly important after, hopefully soon, we begin to see the global pandemic begin to subside. So thank you, and I will leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ariel. Dr. Solis, please take it away.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't ready for that. Excellent. Well, Lisa, thank you very much for having us here. And we're very excited to be part of the SMU Texas-Mexico Center. I'm glad that the center is embarking on these type of incredible opportunities. So my brief talk today is going to be focused more on the economic opportunities, not as an academician. I'm talking more about workforce and economic development opportunities as a region, because coming firsthand, I was born in Texas, but I was raised in Mexico most of my life, worked in the public and in the private sector, primarily along the border most of my life, and worked with different industries and manufacturing and workforce areas, setting up companies, industrial parks throughout the border, primarily Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. So I'm very familiar with the workforce, the type of people and the culture that Mexico brings to this entire region. And as Ariel just mentioned, very well presented, we need to look at this entire region, or this whole movement of Mexican labor, educated, skilled labor into the United States, as a complement to this entire globalization that continues taking place. That is an opportunity that we have to take advantage of. This whole economic transformation that we've seen in other parts of the planet, where we can set up these, what I call mini innovative centers of industry clusters throughout the entire border, all the way up, of course, into Texas. I'm glad that Mr. Ariel had the breakdown of the industries, because that is very interesting, how the educated workforce of Mexico has been able to assimilate into these industry needs. Surprisingly, especially in the educational settings. Not surprisingly, of course, is in the construction. That is where this continues to be an incredible demand. And that is one where Texas can benefit by using the economies of scales, because the Mexican educated workforce is one that's not scared of work. They love to work. That's part of the culture of Mexico. Family, work, and then education. And so that's what we're doing here at the community college, is we are focusing, we'll talk about that in a while. Mr. Gonzalez will elaborate on our certification and our programs that we have that address those needs. For me, it's more important to talk about the entire situation in Mexico, which I'll touch on later about the immigration situation. But I know that the discussion today is more on the legal educated immigrant workforce. And I have firsthand experience of working with them. Interestingly, back in 2005, when I was doing my dissertation at the University of Texas in Austin, I also participated in a dissertation on the resiliency, very specific, but very much to this point, the resiliency of the undocumented Mexican workforce assimilating into United States, and how were they able to succeed. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I was more focused on how they succeeded in higher education, not having the documentation. But it makes one very good point, that the Mexican, regardless of documented or undocumented, when they come to the United States, the vast majority wants to succeed and assimilate into the United States economy, into the demographics. The acculturation is a different situation where, as mentioned also, is one that we need to understand and be able to embrace, because the common denominator of, there's one thing that brings all of the Latin cultures that no other culture on the planet has, and you can see by the proof when it comes to the United States, that is the language. The Spanish language, as you know, has remained for centuries in the United States. And you look at all the other cultures from other parts of the world, it eventually disappears after the second or third generation. But the Mexican or the Latin America one remains. They continue speaking Spanish. I think we see that. That's one that we need to understand and embrace and take advantage of. And we can go into later, as Mr. Ariel mentioned, in Spanish classes, programs, and certification opportunities. Because right now, the big demand and the key is we need to be able to compete together. All of Mexico and United States, primarily the border region, Texas, Mexico. We have an incredible opportunity to be able to work to compete with the other parts of the planet, especially in areas in the manufacturing and the technology, because otherwise we're going to lose out on this incredible competitive world. And number two, on the other industry, that I'm very proud of opportunities is in the health area. We know that even regardless of with the pandemic, there's a huge demand in the nursing and health careers. Here at Laredo College, we know firsthand how important and how critical is the Mexican skilled educated force been. Y'all might not be aware, but Laredo College nursing program has been ranked #1 for the past 4 years in Texas, and been ranked #1 in the LVN nursing programs in the entire United States and in the Southwest United States. And y'all know why? That's because more than half of our students are educated students from Mexico. There are doctors and nurses that come here, and they elevate the bar and the quality of students in our classrooms. And that's one big surprise to many people, because we've been ranked in the nursing programs on the NCLEX exam, on the passing exam, 100% passing for the past 4 years. I'm not going to mention, but I'm sure there's no other university, not even in Texas, that has that type of attainment of that 100% passing rate. So this study here really hones in into claiming that, yes, the Mexican educated workforce is one that we need to not only understand, but we need to be able to bring it into the entire workforce, especially into health. And there's a lot of other demand area, not only in nursing, but of course, from radiology, physical therapy, I can go on and on, especially with the baby boomers, the aging workforce. There's going to be so much demand that we don't need to fear about that. The fear of having, of course, too much immigrants are coming in or taking jobs away. That's not the case. There's going to be so much demand. We're going to need even more. And of course, we got to find some educational and policy issues, how we can be able to attain that and give qualifications for the educated Mexican workforce so they can be able to quickly qualify and giving them credit. That's another long discussion. I realize that will take hours to go into that, but we need to consider that very strongly, just like in the technical and the technology ones, and then in the labor high skilled, especially in manufacturing, especially now that we're going to be transforming into other alternative energies. Of course, here in Laredo, we're already getting ready and to even transform into our transportation programs from hydrogen to other energy sources, and that's going to require an incredible amount of labor force to sustain the demand that U.S.-Mexico is taking place. And we need to all understand that without the Mexican manufacturing that all of these U.S. companies have in Mexico, primarily along the border, without that, we wouldn't be competitive worldwide. And that's why it's very important. Now, I know the discussion is how are the Mexican educated force is succeeding in Texas. But again, we have to understand the whole panorama behind it. And that's why I wanted to give you that background, how we've seen how valuable they are, and at least not only from the workforce, but even in the educational setting. They certainly benefit, and it has I've seen the difference, the increase of the Mexican educated force assimilating here, and by different means. And the best part, they remain in Texas when they get their nursing degrees, or the physical therapy, or the ultrasound program that we have here, these short-term 2-year degrees, they remain here because there's so much big demand that we're never going to be able to reach that full employment. There's just too much demand in that area. So we need to, all of these institutions, find a way to work with our policymakers and find how we can be able to bring other programs and give credit so we can be able to move faster. Anyway, I'll get back to you in a while. I know there's other discussion. I'm going to let Mr. Michael Gonzalez talk about specific areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Solis. I appreciate that very much. And Ariel, thank you so much as well for your work and your research. Really fascinating and really helps to set the stage for this discussion today. So thank you very much to you both. I'll keep my remarks fairly brief, but just a little bit about myself. Like Dr. Solis, born in Texas, but born here on the border, here in Laredo. Spent most of my life and work here on the border, helping to further our community. Went and got my business degrees from the University of Notre Dame and the Texas A&M system here locally. And so I think that I can help maybe add some perspective to this discussion. I think that while in looking at the research, Ariel, I think that I would agree that more of the Mexican immigrant population is educated than ever has been before, and we do see that, I think, here on the border. But it was refreshing to see that you are noting that this is not a brand new trend, that this has been happening for some years now, and that's important to us because that's something that we see quite a bit, and that has been happening for some time. And I would tell you that here on the border, this group actually has been a very good source of high quality human capital across various industries for the border. I also understand and agree that changing policy to allow for more translation where appropriate of degrees that are earned in Mexico would be advantageous to the Texas economy. I think that's also very important. Now, that said, there are a number of instances where we need to take some care, especially in the medical field, the sciences, occupational and technical fields and things of that nature, where there's significant, property and or lives at stake. We should take additional steps just to make sure that all of those meet United States standards, right? And in many cases, and Dr. Solis pointed very correctly at this, they do, and they add quite a bit to our institutions, especially as Dr. Solis mentioned in our nursing program and what we've been able to achieve there. So I think that's really important. And maybe, again, alluding to the point that Dr. Solis made, there's additional opportunities like those that we find in our nursing program where educated Mexican immigrants can take courses within the community college system, maybe even within the university system, to validate the education and to confirm all those things and to get them ready for workforce here in the United States and finalize those things. And there's also ways, I think, to get them to their highest potential in terms of contribution here in the United States in other ways. One example could be maybe Mexican immigrants that are educated in engineering, as an example, that could take some additional courses through the community college system in some of the technical and vocational programs such as, HVAC, plumbing, and other industries, and then use that to, continue with entrepreneurial, opportunities. I think that's another thing that we've seen on the border, and that has worked very well to add both to the outcomes and to the reaching of the potential for the Mexican immigrant to the United States, but also maximum potential for that local, regional, and the Texas economy as a whole. So I think that's really important. I would also like to make a quick note that, particularly on the border and specifically in Laredo, when you talk about the Mexican immigrant and particularly the educated Mexican immigrant, the vast majority of them are coming from the states of Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. And particularly in Nuevo León, the educated immigrants are graduates of the Tecnológico in Monterrey. That's a highly prestigious school in Mexico, and they are high caliber professionals that our border community benefits from once they come to the United States. And the positive impact, I believe, of these professionals on our economy here on the border is absolutely remarkable, and I think something that people need to take note of. And clearly, one of the things that I really thought was also quite eye-opening, Ariel, in your research, was when you did look at the different industries, right? You started to look at, where are the Mexican educated immigrants finding employment once they come to the United States. I think it would be also equally important, and I'd like to do that for just a minute, to look at how that compares to Texas as a whole, not just for the Mexican immigrant, but the state as a whole, but also I think on the border, and particularly our metropolitan area here in the Laredo region. And so, Ariel, you were looking at elementary and secondary schools, construction, food service, hospitals, and higher education. Now, if you look all the way out to Texas statewide, you can see that changes to computer specialists as number one. And this is all Texas Workforce Commission targeted occupation data, and then goes off to nursing, which we've discussed. And then if you look at the remaining 8 occupations within the top 10, they are all within various trade and vocational areas, such as electricians, plumbers, automotive mechanics, bus mechanics, HVAC technicians, welders, and truck drivers. And so I just wanted to make that comparison because there are more opportunities out there, I think, that maybe aren't being taken advantage of. Now, if you focus in just a little bit more on the border area, and particularly here in Laredo, you can see that there are border implications to where people are getting employed as well. So if you look at Laredo, number one is in truck driving and also freight laborers. Laredo is the number one inland port in the country. And as you can tell, the jobs bear that out. The jobs available in targeted occupations bear that out. And I want to talk in just a minute about transportation and logistics in particular, and how the educated immigrant from Mexico really does benefit the border and really Texas and the nation when they apply themselves to this particular industry. But as you continue down looking locally, it does start to match up. Things like education, teaching, those sorts of things really start to match up. And then, of course, the top 5 here locally, nursing, which we've talked a lot about, and how the medical field, and particularly nursing, is aided by the educated Mexican immigrant. So I think that there are, ultimately, I wanted to share that with this group to just say there are additional areas that are already being impacted by the educated Mexican immigrant, and I think additional opportunities in the future where they can continue to make a big impact both on the border and I think throughout Texas. So I think that's important as well. Ariel, the other thing that you did mention in your research was a discussion on language, and Dr. Solis is very right in saying that one of the key characteristics of our culture is that we continue to keep our Spanish language, right? To varying levels. And so what I would say here is that while I see some validity to Ariel's point around that, in some cases, providing some barriers to persons that are educated from Mexico immigrating here to the United States, I would say that this is starting to change. And I would tell you, particularly on the border, most, if not all, business can be conducted in Spanish here on the border. And so as people are going through the process of continuing to assimilate and continuing to learn English, they can still, reach some pretty significant potential with the speaking of Spanish. And I would contend also that that's continuing to change throughout Texas and beyond as immigration continues throughout our country. And additionally, with community colleges specifically, many community colleges, at Laredo College, we are certainly one of those. We provide English as a second language training at no cost out into the community. And this is funding that comes directly from the Texas Workforce Commission. And so these are courses that are very highly sought after, classes that are filled quite frequently here on our campus. And so the need is definitely there. And so maybe there's additional opportunity through some of these agencies to expand these educational opportunities in ESL so that we can continue to expedite the learning of the English language for non-native speakers. So I think that that's another thing that may help us to eliminate that barrier. And I guess as I round out my remarks, what I would say is this. One of the things that I'm really heartened by and refreshed by is the discussion that we're all having today. And the reason for that is because I think that it will continue to go a long way toward changing the narrative around immigration, and particularly Mexican immigrants coming to the United States, into Texas and all across the United States. Whether you look at recent works such as a book released by former President George W. Bush, Of the Many One, and where he's trying to change the narrative around immigration, and groups such as the Texas Border Coalition and the Texas Opportunity Coalition that are also doing big work to change the narrative around immigration and its benefits throughout Texas and the United States. I think that the ultimate goal for all of us should just be a substantive national conversation about immigration that will actually affect policy change while making sure that we maintain secure borders and continue to grow our economy to its maximum possible potential. I think that making changes to policy within immigration is great for both Wall Street and Main Street. And we see this daily on the border in terms of the high quality human capital that comes from Mexico. And the last thing that I'd like to say is that I think that there's a significant difference between good policy and good politics. And I think that what Ariel's doing and what we're contributing to is important because it helps us to utilize data to change the narrative and remove the politicization of this issue, focus on the data so that we can make great policy change. And as one last point of data, Ariel, I really did enjoy your research and looking that over and look forward to continuing to discuss these things with this group, with you, Ariel, and with the entire group at SMU and throughout Texas. So thank you. I'll leave it right there.
Thank you so much, Michael, Dr. Solis, and Ariel. The conversation was going, and we already have several questions, both here through the people listening through Zoom and through Facebook Live. So we're just going to jump in and continue this conversation. Michael, really building from what you just said, kind of expanding how much more Dr. Takayuchi, one of our faculty members here, would love to hear you go more in depth about how these high-skilled Mexican immigrants are impactful on Texas businesses and potentially creating businesses. Ariel, did we see that entrepreneurial kind of line in the research, since Texas is the fastest growing economy still in the United States? So talking about, what are they doing? And Dr. Takayuchi is also adding that Mexican migrants tend to work in the same company longer. So are we missing some opportunities of them moving around? Doesn't that suggest that higher education for Mexican immigrants would be even a larger positive impact for Texas businesses given their long-term commitment? So it's a big question, but Dr. Takayuchi wants you to tackle all things highly skilled Mexican migrants.
Well, I'll try to do my best, but I may defer some of this to Dr. Solis. I really feel like he is our expert in terms of economic development and particularly transportation and logistics. But what I can tell you is this: in all the partnerships that we have on our college, we have the Laredo Licensed U.S. Customs Brokers Association and a number of other organizations that are on our campus. And I can tell you, in working with professionals from throughout those organizations, that you can see in daily operations the positive effect of educated immigrants from Mexico on that community. That's what helps, in my mind, to facilitate the trade that we have and to make Laredo the #1 inland port. But in doing that, making Texas the powerhouse that it is in terms of the relationship, economic and otherwise, between the United States and Mexico. But I would open it to Dr. Solis for his comments, because again, I believe he's probably our expert in that area. Dr. Solis?
Yes, thank you, Michael. Yeah, we're talking about some broad questions that try not to be repetitive of the Mexican skill market, or those that have graduated. More Mexicans are graduating in college now in Mexico. And of course, we see this whole discussion as many are coming to the U.S. for many reasons. Of course, we're looking for a better life, and because they know where there's demand and opportunities, especially in the construction areas and in the small business areas as well. And of course, others, of course, unfortunately, are fleeing due to the violent situation, which I've seen firsthand, and very aware of that. And that's a different group of people. Although many of those that were, medium to large business people already came over a decade ago, especially in the Houston and the Dallas, San Antonio area. And of course, even in the Valley, you see a lot of the middle class and upper Mexican class. They came along all over the border years ago due to, well, not only economic opportunity, but mainly because of the violence as well. And they have assimilated into the U.S. and remain and invested, and then their kids are going to school in the U.S. That's why you've seen a huge growth in the Valley or along the border, especially Rio Grande Valley and El Paso. You've seen that take place in the last easily 15, 20 years for those reasons that I mentioned. And they have become a huge part of the economy, and they have assimilated very well. And of course, there's many opportunities once they become assimilated and they're living, correctly with the proper permits in the U.S. and legalized. They become extremely needed in the economy, and it's one that we embrace here and we continue. That's why you've seen that big growth all along the border. I know there's many other questions, so I'm going to leave it open so we can, if any specific ones that they want to be addressed.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to add to that, but if not, I still had a question for you, which is one that Carlos Carpizo, an entrepreneur here in Dallas, is talking about, and I want to lean into your further research on immigration and also in Central America. This new trend of highly educated Mexican migrants and other migrants, does that mean there's a tremendous brain drain, much larger than we were expecting in Mexico and in Central American countries as they are seeking opportunities here or coming here?
Well, that's a good question too. So let me go back to the first one just for a moment and say that in the research, we don't really have a measure to look at self-employment and entrepreneurship yet. What we have seen is that they have high labor participation routes, and those labor participation often do not mean just one job. It could be that the people are working multiple jobs, as we've seen before. And I think Texas is, if the national rate holds in Texas, which I think it would, you would see that as well there. So again, we don't have specific data to say how many of them are doing self-employment, but we know that many of them do have multiple jobs, even if they have a formal job, say, for example, in an elementary or secondary school. The second point, the second question that you asked, Luisa, is more about what's happening in Mexico. And I think, one of the key things to note is that certainly Mexican education attainment increased in the since 2010 going forward, and that's not only what we've seen is making more Mexican migration reduce to the United States. Actually, we've seen a reduction in Mexican migration since 2010 to the United States, but it's also become more specialized. meaning that there are people in Mexico that are trying to find the avenues to find employment adequate for their skills and their skill level. We've seen, again, if there was one thing that we should sort of a mythbuster type of point to make sure, is that the large majority of Mexicans that we look here in the data are here with a form of legal status. And that means they actually have to leverage a lot of different opportunities in the other place. And then the second component, even for those here who are here with a legal status or undocumented, Texas has been one of the, since the beginning, Texas has been actually one of the first states to allow institution, provide, and therefore the DACA, there are some DACA immigrants in this population that I suggested. But in terms of brain drain from these countries, and especially from Mexico, I think it would be a minority of the larger share of Mexicans coming to the U.S. In fact, you know, we've seen more Mexican the educational attainment that's staying in Mexico City and other urban areas. My guess from looking at the data is that a lot of the, and I think this rings true to some of the comments that were mentioned beforehand, is that the majority of Mexicans who come to Texas are coming from Mexican border states, from Monterrey and from other places that are, you know, really providing a sustainability and reach to a binational and transnational type of agenda. So I don't know much about Central Americans, so I won't get into that, but the other numbers, and I should, you know, for all transparency, China and India also have significantly increasing populations of highly educated immigrants. But the thing that's all often missing is that Mexicans are not too far behind.
Thank you, Ariel. We have a question from Maria Cervantes from the University of British Columbia in Canada. She thanks the great panelists. Thank you, Maria. Do you all detect any specific trends relating to credential recognition? We know that's one of the challenges. Is it a bigger challenge for specific industries, or is it just across the board that we're seeing that as an issue, the lack of, you know, credentialization recognition?
Yes, that certainly continues being an issue or a problem. It's one that needs a vast more improvement in my experience, especially in all the academia. And that's why there's a lot of memorandums of understanding that you see and programs with different universities. However, when it comes to industry, which is really the key, the short-term industry, especially amongst the community colleges, that's where we need to improve. And of course, that's where the accreditation agencies come. Especially in health. In health, all the students have to start all over again, and they're willing to, but there's just got to be a better way to improve this recognition of credentials from Mexico in all areas, not just experience, but the classes, so we can be able to mobilize, because the Mexican immigrant is a very mobile population, and they will, and not only Mexicans, but all, of course, in different areas, but it's one that we need to take advantage of because of our location. And this is with Texas and Mexico. And this is, I continue saying, this is an opportunity that all of us, especially the economy, and not only in Texas, but in the entire US, in many specific areas. But specifically, of course, here we see a lot of transnational type of Mexican immigrants that remain here, but their businesses are all related to international trade, from warehousing, logistics, to handling, to shipping, of course, transportation. And that's huge for the U.S. economy. And that's what helps out the American producer and manufacturer on both sides to continue growing, expanding, and be able to take advantage of this whole dual environment. And we need to find a better way to improve it and continue adhering to policies. And again, back to the education, I know that question there, and not only in Texas, but in the entire United States, we need to find a way to become more proactive and recognizing there's an incredible amount of Mexican technical universities and technical colleges that specialize in engineering, a lot more than the US, surprisingly. There's a lot more, they're very technical all on the border, that we see that not only in artificial intelligence and robotics, but in many other areas that are highly technical that we don't have here. We wish we had about that amount of students that are interested, or those type of curriculum. But unfortunately, when they come here, they're not recognized, and they have to start all over again, especially on the community colleges. And that's why that data is hard to be able to quantify, because we do not ask a student that's living here legally or has the proper permits or residency. The citizenship is optional in the application, so it's hard to quantify. if they're first generation or they just arrived or they've been here for so long. That's really hard. And of course, I know that the SMU has that research. It's difficult to attain that information, but it's one that we respect. And as long as they can meet the minimum requirements to enroll, that's the beauty about community colleges, is that we're open access to everyone. And that's the quickest way, the fastest way for any type of Mexican educated skilled worker to come to the United States. And if they want to be able to attain a US approved, recognized credential, that's the fastest way to attain that type of success. And then they can go into the universities once they've been able to attain that. Michael, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, sir. I think that does cover it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And just Solis, we have a question from Dr. Hollyfield, Jim Hollyfield. Dr. Solis, building to what you just say, and Ariel, maybe you have some data behind this. And so how many of these highly skilled Mexican migrants that we're seeing are leading really, truly transnational lives, coming back and forth between, Texas and Mexico? Is there any way for us to quantify that? And furthermore, how has the pandemic in any way impacted that? And, as we've seen, movement across the border, not be as the ease of travel not be there anymore.
Yes, well, of course, the pandemic has hurt a lot, and all over the whole transnational movement, not only with the worker, but even with the commerce alone. And that's a little bit absurd, where we are not allowing tourists or people that are willing to invest or purchase to come across on a daily basis. That still baffles me how we still have that. We had all these months of not allowing that. And so we'll get over that, I know, eventually. And of course, that answer, I'm sure Mr. Ariel has that on the amount of people that are here at transnational. Again, that's hard to quantify, but it's one that has been around. It's continuing to grow. Once we come back to the normalcy after the pandemic, we're going to see that the transnational going back and forth. And so I'm not sure if I answered the question. It's a very broad one that we can go in many areas. But again, we just need to be more open and receptive to allow a lot more temporary workers to come in and work in specialized areas that are in high demand. And the view right now, even right now with the pandemic, it is, from what I understand, with the people, anybody who has a warehouse or a forwarding agency, which is, there are hundreds of them along the border, and I should say thousands of companies. And I know for a fact they're having an incredible difficulty finding skilled, able, and willing workers to come in, paying them $10, $12 an hour right now, and for many reasons. But they're just, because I'm not going to go into the politics. We know, from the whole the stimulus money, that's part of it as well. But right now, if you have that type of business, you're having a very difficult time just finding an administrative assistant that is willing to. I'm not sorry, an administrative assistant, but more in the technical and in those fields that they're having difficulty finding people. And if they come in, they only come in very temporarily, and then they leave to somebody or to other ventures, or because back again to the economy, the way the federal government is stimulating it, many people prefer not to work. But that's another matter. I don't want to get into that discussion.
And if I could add to that for just a second, and that would just be to say that I think in very, very short order, we need to have a very robust conversation so that people across Texas and across the United States can understand the sense of urgency that we all should have around opening our borders, our bridges and our legal borders there for commerce. Again, Dr. Solis touched on that, but I can't emphasize that enough. Businesses across the border are being affected negatively, and throughout Texas. We need to open our bridges and our ports of entry as soon as is possible, because the Mexican shopper and the Mexican worker are both very important to Texas, and that's in addition to what we're talking about today with the immigrated population.
Really excellent point, Michael, on the shopper and the impact that the lack of that shopper that comes in, and it is really impactful for even small businesses along the border. Ariel, do you have any data that you'd like to add or comments?
Well, so comments generally, since I don't have the data, but there is one thing that a future study could do is look at the time in the US that these migrants have been into. I did only a snapshot of that when I showed you that first graph that had the the darker blue bars and darker purple bars. And I think it showed that the people who are coming in the last 5 years, meaning that they have been in Texas for at least 5 years or in the United States for at least 5 years, show higher proportion of having college or bachelor's degree. And so that's important. And to me, that would signify that, yes, the people that are staying longer, the people that have been here for decades or more, are likely to have more opportunities to have a degree here with us. And we know that the Mexican population across the United States, but also in Texas, has become a longer settled population as well. So there may be some interchange and movement temporary for months or maybe a few months here in the year, but overall the Mexican population has become more settled and well settled in the United States.
Thank you, Ariel. So we are about to wrap up, and I always ask this one last question of our speakers. Ariel kind of maybe you already revealed his myth buster, but I always ask in our conversations with one, the number one myth buster you like to kind of leave our public with from this conversation or in general from the border and your expertise. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. Number one myth buster.
Yeah, I think the number one myth buster for me is making sure that people understand what it's going to take to keep our economy growing and keep and that has a lot to do with the educated Mexican immigrant, right? And how do you keep them around? I think it's all about environment, opportunity, right? And narrative. I think so, things like making sure that there are both opportunities for them to get educated, to learn the language, entrepreneurial opportunities, that sort of thing. And, narrative in terms of people feeling welcome here in the United States and understanding that they're welcome to start businesses and to become assimilated and a part of our country. So I think those are really important for everybody to understand.
Wonderful. Dr. Solis?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of my discussion, not perhaps is a myth, but is one that is very important to understand. As I mentioned, the Mexican culture is one that thrives on wanting to work. That is a priority, and you've seen it at all levels, at every level that are willing to take any job and throughout the United States, and that will continue. And then the other one is the language. Yeah, like as I proved to you that continues. The Spanish language will continue for centuries to continue. Unlike the other cultures in the nation, you see that they eventually evaporate after a few generations. But this will always continue. So we need to strategically and smartly work around with it and accept that the language is going to continue being part. It's a culture. So as I mentioned, the Mexican immigrant, they are very good at assimilating immediately. However, a culture rating is a different matter. That a culture rating will not be part of it. And so we have to work with those two forces. And so that's very important to understand. And thirdly, very quickly, and we talked about skilled labor, so since we're focusing on that, it's very important that we continue in understanding these opportunities and these short-term diplomas and certifications. How can we work that to help the economy? This is not just because of the Mexican immigrant. The U.S. economy needs that. That whole transformation has changed the whole educational paradigm now. And of course, the pandemic has made it worse, where the short-term attainment or short-term concentration now is going to require even more short-term diplomas amongst all cultures, but especially with the Mexican immigrants that are here. We're going to went through all of these areas, like I mentioned, not only in the areas of skilled areas, but transportation especially, and then all the skilled labor that goes in to the services supporting transportation. That's not going to go away. It's always going to be this whole international trade is going to require trucking and transportation, but then all the skill needed to be able to manage and support and all of the equipment, machines and trucks and tires and on and on. And that is very important with that. And then of course, construction. Right now, there's a boom in construction, but you ask any contractor, their biggest challenge is to find the willing and able workforce to hire. That's huge right now. And I see it because we're constantly building and improving our buildings throughout our two campuses. And that's always the delay now, that our contractors cannot find workers. And that's all over Texas, I'm pretty sure, all over the place, that are willing to able to take on these are skilled labor jobs, from plumbing to electricians, that type of work. And it's very difficult. And then machinists as well. And this is a whole domino effect that we need to embrace and be able to work with the Mexican educated skilled workforce in these specific areas. It's very important because this is for the survivability and the long-term sustainability of the U.S., especially the Texas economy. And back to the academic portion of it, that's why I hope people understand, we're talking about community colleges and universities. On the other extreme, I know many people that are right now unemployed because they graduated from a traditional four-year university with a general degree in liberal arts. I'm not going to go into that, I'm sorry, I hope I don't offend anybody. Sociology or whatever, political science, and that's it. But there's just no jobs in that area. And I've seen the proof. So I mentioned as your earlier administrative assistant, when we advertise for that, and when we'll be flooded with people, even with master's degree, but in very general areas with no experience, no skills. So that tells you that whole paradigm is switched now, where there's a huge demand in the technical areas, but the broad one, of course, it necessitates people with a general four-year degree to either go back to the community college and get a technical degree, or go on to get a master's degree and continue education, which will take longer. That's fine. I did that many years ago because that's what I had to do even back then in the 80s, get a master's degree, because a general degree in economics was not sufficient. But now it's worse, that situation. So anyway, those are points to consider. And that's what I want to say. Thank you very much. And we'll look forward to more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Solis. Ariel, your last myth buster.
Well, to be concise, the majority of the Mexican immigrant population in the States is here with legal authorization, and the education attainment of that population is only increasing every year that we are seeing now, and we can expect that trend to continue. The bottom line is that 1 in 10 Mexican immigrants in Texas have a bachelor's degree, and that we can expect that to continue. And there's a significant opportunity for both the local governments and the state government to be able to leverage that opportunity to engage with and to provide opportunities for them to really exercise their degrees, and therefore help not only their communities, but also the economies that they're a part of. So I'll leave it like that.
Well, Ariel ends it and perfectly summarizes, our policy brief and the research and policy perspectives that the Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center at SMU wants to share with our public. I hope everybody goes and checks out the research at our website. Again, smu.edu/Texas Mexico. You'll find much more information. We'll also post a video of this discussion on our website so you can share it with friends and colleagues. I want to thank Michael, Dr. Solis, and Ariel Ruiz Soto, our research fellow, for giving us an hour of their time and this very lively discussion. We could not do what we do without brilliant minds helping us move the conversation forward. Claudia put in the Q&A that this is a great and needed conversation. I couldn't agree more. So thank you all for being great panelists. Thanks to the public for joining us. Thanks to those watching on Facebook Live. Again, visit our website, and I hope you join us on our next discussion coming up, which will also center on education and workforce. So thank you all. I hope you have a great day, and thank you to our panelists.
Muchas gracias.